Black Studies was born in the academy of an insurgency. It was the first, and in many ways remains the only academic formation that was demanded by the people.
Black Studies is not trying to show that black people contributed to white people's lives. Black Studies is not trying to prove we're equal. Black Studies is trying to demonstrate what we have done, not proving what we have done, but to demonstrate what we already have done.
This is our duty, to know our past and honor it, to engage our present and improve it, and to imagine a whole new future and to forge it in the most ethical, effective, and expansive ways.
With the coming of emancipation, there's a renewed assault on the character of black folk. In fact, the way the Europeans phrase it is that African people, black folk in the U.S., are reverting to savagery. So the Quasi-Free had to respond to the attacks on the African being, right? You've got Hegel, you got Thomas Jefferson, you got all these Europeans and people who are becoming white Americans making scandalous lies about Africa and African people and their intellectual capacity, their moral character, and even their beauty. So we begin with the period of enslavement, and that there's a deep and profound need on the part of the quasi-free. And by quasi-free, I'm borrowing John Hope Franklin's term, because these people, while they were not enslaved, they did not have human rights, let alone civil rights in this society, right? And so in that sense, we think of them as only partially free. But we're talking about a moment in the history of people of African descent in this country in which only about 2% of black folks held college degrees. And only a few hundred had PhDs, right? Actually, maybe not even 100 if we're talking about the 1920s. So there's not enough of them to do the work. Enslaved Africans in the U.S., right? They conceived of the slave masters and the white folks they interacted with as being avaricious, that's to say greedy, as having no respect for God. They seen them as mean and excessively cruel. So they had an analysis of white people, and I'm talking about the enslaved population. And remember, the largest majority of the quasi-free were people who self-emancipated themselves. That's to say, they escaped. They had been enslaved. Their parents had been enslaved. And what they're bringing forward, right? What Delaney is bringing forward, what Douglass is bringing forward, what Mariah Stewart, what Sojourner Truth, what they're bringing forward is the understanding of the slave community.
You can't even begin to study black people until you grapple with Du Bois. Every idea you think is brand new, Du Bois said 1895, 1896, 2000, whatever, right? So you gotta go back, you gotta go Souls of Black Folk, Foundation, Souls of Black Folk, read every word of it.
We can never forget Du Bois and the work that he did, because without Du Bois, we would have had to create a Du Bois. I mean, he was a great defender of African people, particularly in terms of factual knowledge. I mean, he was tremendous. I mean, every people should have had a Du Bois who, on every issue he had to confront, he confronted it in the interest of African people. I mean, there were problems, of course. I mean, one could go back and examine Du Bois in a critical way, but I'm just saying that his service at the crisis was almost like a gatekeeper of knowledge and information about and for African people. And that job, that role was a long-term job of Du Bois defending and advancing African people as he saw it.
But Du Bois wasn't a radical in the sense of like swinging at people, punching people out, that kind of stuff. Garvey is the one, you go back, because we kind of miss Garvey. Garvey said, ain't nothing wrong with being black. In fact, if you stand up and kind of act black, you might get somewhere. So Garvey came with Up Ye Mighty Race. Now you're sitting there saying, oh, we suffer. I say, you can suffer now, but Up Ye Mighty Race, you can accomplish what you will. Right? Du Bois is saying, you're in the city, you got to behave so you can get along. Garvey said, no, I'm wearing uniforms, I got motorcycles, I got horses, I'm going to have a parade every month. All up now, I'm going to ride in a big car and I got an admiral's hat, I got a band, you're going to hear me coming. Right? You're going to hear the motorcycles, you're going to have the Black Cross nurses. It's like, this is a show. Right? We ain't hiding, this is a show. It's black, black, double black. Right? And I'm the president of all of Africa. So how you going to do that? Because I said so. Now you said, that doesn't make no sense, but that's not a bad idea. White people claim stuff. I'm the provisional president, all of Africa. I ain't got it yet, but that's my goal, right? That's the sensibility, right? Don't duck your head down, you're free. That's what that means. That's what he said. That's what he has that Du Bois didn't have. Du Bois was like leery of the masses rising up too fast because he thought they might not be able to carry through, things at his level of sophistication. Garvey said, stand up and we can do whatever we want, right? That's why he had such power. And that's why you need both of them.
So we're talking about James C. Pennington, we're talking about William Wells Brown, we're talking about David Walker, Mariah Stewart, and so they're crafting a history of Africa largely pulled from biblical sources, but also pulled from Greek and Roman scholars. And they're trying to lay forward an argument about the dignity and the contributions, in fact, the leadership of African people going from Kemet, or what the Greeks called Egypt, all the way through the West African empires of Ghana, Mali, Songhai, to really emphasize that black people were at one point at the cutting edge of intellectual production and the development of human civilization. They lay a solid foundation. They lay a real solid foundation. Delaney, I'd say he's the most consistent and famous progenitor of black nationalism during the antebellum period. He co-edits the North Star with Frederick Douglass, who is considered to be the progenitor of the incorporationist position, meaning that we should be incorporated into the United States.
Martin Delaney, and then Edward Blyden and Alexander Cromwell. I mean, there were these people who began to think, wait a minute, we are a historical people. We have achieved far more than we realize. And they began to think in ways that allowed us, as masses of African people, to begin to see a little bit of light. There were African people who felt deeply that somehow we were not only misunderstood, but we misunderstood ourselves. We did not know our own history, our culture. We didn't know our languages. We had lost them in many ways, even though we had gained with the use of Ebonics. So people were, there were people who thought about these things, and they were seriously, they thought about these things. I mean, so much so that even as early as the 1820s, the late 1820s, when David Walker wrote, I mean, David Walker was talking about Africans in Egypt, and he was talking about the Egyptians as black people. So there was some sense in black people that there was something missing, and we didn't know exactly what it was. But of course, you get 246 years of enslavement. And so that 246 years of enslavement for the masses of our people meant that we were outside of our own history. There was little light in terms of people being able to read and understand and to get the kind of information that we needed to get to have a strong sense of our history, our culture, and so forth.
There's this sense that it isn't just an academic exercise. This is political. The reason I'm rereading the Bible, the reason I'm questioning Christianity is because I'm trying to free my people. So when you read Ben Yakin in the 70s, you're reading the same type of energy as David Walker in the 1820s. He's in that tradition, as you say, with the use of texts he's an autodidact, almost in a sense of a European classicist. I'm going to read the Bible that way as well. And when I'm reading the Bible, David Walker makes an intervention that we still haven't come to terms with. When he says the Egyptians were black, which means, okay, that's the thing people would say, okay, that's early and he's making the challenge. Yeah, but watch what he does with that. He then says, that doesn't mean that they couldn't be oppressors. He's saying, so what he's doing is he's troubling blackness in the appeal to the point to saying, yeah, when you see what y'all saying happened to the Hebrews in Egypt, whether or not it's historically accurate, if it did happen, it's black on black crime. So now he's engaged in an internal conversation. He said they're on both sides of the waters. In other words, when you cross the Red Sea, or the Reed Sea, really, when you cross that marsh, Egypt controls that side too. So y'all let these fairy tales go. But he's doing it as a scholar. I think it's a remarkable intervention. And people who say they're doing black studies now, if you're not grappling with, people like to say, oh, the black community is not a monolith. Yeah, David Walker knew that. What are you talking about? And then what ultimately is the purpose of your scholarship? There's a reason why Abdullah Keleman and them come up with the idea of academic excellence and social responsibility. Black studies is a place you come to wedge your intellectual work to transformation of your community. And so in that respect, Walker is absolutely in that tradition.
David Walker certainly stands out amongst that generation, but I would say that he's the leading edge. He's not unique, right? The term that has been used for that generation of black activist intellectuals, black scholar activists, if you will, is Ethiopianness. Because Europeans called all black folk Ethiopians, right? Call everybody Ethiopians. That's the level of their knowledge at some level. So what they're doing, someone like Walker, is he understands that in order to liberate black folk, right, you have to develop a sense of efficacy. People must have pride in who they are. And I think it's important to understand that the study of the black studies evolves over successive periods, and that we have to look at what some people call a prehistory. What they're trying to get at is that there's a moment, 68 forward, in which a formal academic discipline is created, right? And so this group of scholars, initially they're working in the field of history, or history as it is evolving.
But if we go back 40 years, go back even closer to 50 years, I think the real theoreticians, the real kind of founders of this way of thinking in terms of discipline, and when I say black studies in the university, I'm only talking about methodology and discipline. I don't consider just about anything that's being done now from people who are doing black studies as black studies. You got to think about methodology. The methodological interventions, the people who are the most important, thinkers like Martin Delany, who in the 1850s and 60s begins to say, how do we think differently about being black in the world? Who goes to West Africa, who tries to learn a little bit of Yoruba as he's over there. Who his last book, 1879, The Origins of Races and Color, he's trying to deal with the hieroglyphs. So to me, that theoretical intervention, Du Bois, in very similar fashion, spends his whole life trying to create and recreate interventions. In that founding category, Carter Woodson, I think. Woodson, especially for the idea that these stories, these narratives must be told from the people themselves.
Carter Woodson spent his whole life. He just says, simply, I'm going to give my life for my people. I will do my work. I will advance the cause of African people, and I will create institutions. I'll create journals. I'll create associations. I mean, this was a spirit of sacrifice. Alice Dunbar and other people, men and women, were engaged in this process of the uplift of the race. I mean, we cannot forget Mary McLeod Bethune, for example, I mean, who herself was dedicated to the education of African children.
Thinking about narrative, Zora Hurston. But in terms of, and then I'll just skip over this, so many other people, Sterling Brown, you know, I wouldn't say Elaine Locke. I think for some reason, because Locke was so deeply invested and trained in Western aesthetics that even his attempt to intervene still methodologically is coming from someplace else. Not that it isn't valuable, but to kind of summarize, I think Black studies for me by the late 60s is relying heavily on people like Vincent Harding and Lerone Bennett, who are writing in a popular vein, but also trying to shift the way we think about narrative.
And the seminal scholar of that moment is George Washington Williams. And Washington Williams is credited with producing what folks agree is the first scientific study of African and what would become African Americans' history, the history of black people. And so that generation that begins with George Washington Williams, and I would say culminates with Carter G. Woodson's creation of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. We now know it as the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And so we have to understand that that's a major building block for black study.
And Lorenzo Turner, who taught Africanisms, you know, African culture, New World survivals. Turner is the one that absolutely convinced me that you don't have to go to Africa to find Africa. It's already here. It's in you, you know. And you walk into the Pentecostal church and they're doing a ring shout, right? Or they're being written by the Orishas. They don't know that. They don't know that. They don't know the names of the Orishas. They know them in Latin America. But when the Holy Ghost comes in and them sisters start to labor in the spirit, they're being written by an Orisha. God is in their bodies. That's African. And so what we learn from Turner and what we learn in Black Study, the way we ought to teach, is that we are a modern people. We're the first modern people. We're the best modern people because we take our African sensibility and make the world new. That has influenced the whole Western Hemisphere, right? There is no popular culture in this country that's not African-based.
Even Frederick Douglass, activist intellectual, certainly one of the most towering intellectuals of that period in the 19th century, Dr. Anna Julia Cooper, right? So Lucy Laney, all those people, Francis Watkins Harper, all those people that actually, Alexander Cromwell, we could just go on to name, they did black studies, but it was not self-conscious as a discipline.
I'll never forget, after my first year in law school, I read Manning Marable, How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America. I think that was my introduction to how class might operate in a black state's formation. And I read Molefi Asante's Afrocentricity. That, for me, was the theoretical intervention that opened the door. So I have to have Asante and Manning Marable.
Afrocentricity is the idea that any phenomenon must be examined from the standpoint of African people as subjects and agents of reality. That we are, in effect, in the middle of our own narrative. That we are not simply the looked upon, and we are not spectators to Europe. We are ourselves actors. We are ourselves doers. What do African people see as their own narrative within the context of living on this land? And that is a different vision. So whether it's sociological issues, whether it's religious issues, the question that we interrogate is, what is the central assertion of African people in this phenomenon? And that is the way we come at Afrocentricity. There is no possibility to have a powerful or dynamic African American studies, black studies, Africology, without having an Afrocentric core. If you don't have an Afrocentric core, then what you are doing, you are studying black people, but you are not studying black people as central to their own history. Africology is the Afrocentric study of African phenomena transgenerationally and transcontinentally. So when we say that Africology is a discipline, we say that we are studying African people from an Afrocentric point of view, whether they are in the 14th century BC, 14th century CE, or whether they are in 2018, whether they're in Los Angeles or Lagos, because that gives us a study of Africa, the Caribbean, South America, North America, wherever black people are. That's what we do, and we study black people from the standpoint of the centricity of African people in our own narrative. Our narrative is the most interesting to us for answering the questions that we need to answer.
Kawita is my philosophy, and I created it. I began to create it while I was a graduate student. It's a philosophy of both life, study, and struggle, right? And in fact, in my earliest publication, The Quote of Karenga, it says, nationalism demands study. Show me a nationalist, I show you someone who studies. So from the very beginning, we saw knowledge as a path forward, you know? We saw knowledge as key to what it means to be African and human. In fact, the ancient Egyptian, one of the words for human being that they used was rekid, which means wise and knowing being. So that tells us how important knowledge is to not only defining ourselves, but also for developing ourselves. As I teach within the Kawita framework. I also teach Kawita through Kwanzaa. In fact, one of the ways I serve the interests of my people was to create Kwanzaa, which is a celebration, a Pan-African holiday, which celebrates family, community, and culture. And I created Kwanzaa for three basic reasons. One, to reaffirm our rootedness in African culture, because we're an African people and we were lifted out of our own history and culture by the European and made a footnote and forgotten casualty in here. So what we do, as Cabral said, is return to our history and culture through our struggle. And then second, I did it to give us a time when we as African people all around the world would focus on reaffirming the beauty and goodness, the depth, and our awesome march to human history as African people. This is like no other holiday. This brings Africans on every continent in the world, throughout the world African community, together around this holiday about the celebration of what it means to be African in the world. And finally, of course, I did it to introduce a communitarian way of thinking with the Nguzo Saba, but also with the philosophy of Kawita itself, to think in a communitarian way, to understand, like, well, it's easy to say now in Zulu with Ubuntu, that is, I am a person through other persons, you know? So what we have here, Ngumuntu, Ngabantu. So I am a person through other people, or as we say in Kawita, I am related and relate, and therefore I am.
Black studies is not apologetics. There's nothing wrong with being black. We have a history as complicated and as important as anybody else's on the planet. Well, fundamentally, the black studies is a study of black people, from their African origins all the way through, the African background all the way through to wherever black people appear on the planet. Where they are, what they do, how they act, what they eat, how they make a living, what political power they have, how they organize themselves. It's the study of the black experience writ large, with no exceptions. You know, we don't, no subcategories that we get kicked out. You know, if you're of African descent, you are a subject of the black experience. And black studies tries to be as broad and as deep in that as it possibly can. Black studies is not trying to show that black people contributed to white people's lives. You know, Black studies is not trying to prove we're equal. Black studies is trying to demonstrate what we have done, not proving what we have done, but to demonstrate we already have have done. It's not apologetics. There's nothing wrong with being black. We have a history as complicated and as important as anybody else's on the planet, and that's what we teach.
Well, Black Studies actually is a term that is given to study of African American, African, Caribbean issues and developments that emerged in the 1960s. There was no term specifically Black Studies prior to this development. So Black Studies comes out of a particular era as this collection of courses. And at that time, it had no specific discipline orientation.
In the history of Black studies, as we know, there's always this tension between the material and the spiritual. So in the Black Studies wars of the 1970s and 80s, man, you got Abdullah Kalaman and Ronald Bailey and them, and this is materialist to me. And then you got other people who are coming in like a Linda James Myers or something like this, and no, there's a spiritual dimension to this. We have a Kobe Cambone and spiritual. One of the jobs of Black Studies is to resolve that tension and understand we have to take a holistic approach. We refer to in African studies as intellectual warfare. So I say it's a methodology, it's a grounding, it's really an intellectual technique.
Dr. Nathan Hare, Harold Cruz, myself, and Joe McWhorter, Colin Mott, our position was that Black Studies is an intellectual arm of the Black movement for freedom, for justice, for equality, and that it must, in fact, not be an integrationist project.
Black Studies is the intellectual arm of the civil rights movement. That the civil rights movement, which had so many people from so many different avenues involved, it also stimulated young people who were in colleges, that they would be out on the streets marching for civil rights, and then they come back to these college campuses and found they didn't exist in the books, they didn't exist in the curriculum at all. And so they began to demand that they be included in the curriculum, that they be included in all aspects of study. So then what we see is that the civil rights movement stimulated the need for and the desire for the understanding of Black people in America and in the world.
We argued for a relevant education. What did a relevant education mean? First of all, it meant that it was meaningful to the student, that it reflected their initiative and experience in history as a people, that it talked about our awesome march through human history, as well as talking about other people of color in addition to white people who had become the subject of every sentence almost. Second, that it was useful to the community, useful to engage in and addressing the critical issues that faced us as a people. And third, that we wanted to be reflective of the realities of our community, society, and the world.
The presence of Black studies reveals all the other disciplines as white studies. So no, I'm studying African American history. No, you're in the discipline of history. Intellectual genealogy is history. Your fundamental assumptions about the nature of historical work are history. History in the Western intellectual genealogy is about conflict. It's about who's disagreeing with who, how you gonna challenge this person. There's no genealogy that looks at community. And if you're introducing one, you're engaged in an insurgent activity in your discipline. Africana studies should start with the assumption that we live in a reality that is holistic and must be addressed holistically. And so, your spirit, your body, everything must be addressed. I think that Atlanta University template really in some ways could usefully be used as the birth of Black studies. By the 1920s and 30s, you have folk, of course, as we know, whether it be Carter Woodson and William Leo Hansberry here at Howard, introducing courses in Negro history, ancient Africa. I mean, Hansberry was so advanced that there was nobody at Harvard that could even supervise his PhD. At least that was their excuse. He studied in Nubia in the 1920s and 30s with hundreds, not dozens, hundreds of undergraduates. There was a time when William Leo Hansberry was teaching as many as 750 to 800 students a year with his slides he had to make. I mean, he had to go do this research. George Reisner at Harvard, their correspondence back and forth. That fits comfortably in the long arc of Africana studies as an intellectual genealogy that begins before enslavement and echoes forward. So whether it be John Wesley Work and those cats at Fisk interviewing folk, Ophelia Settle Egypt, Charles Johnson, they're going out collecting the narratives. We talk about the WPA and the slave narratives. No, but did you look at the HBCUs where they're literally doing that kind of work? Zora Hurston going down to interview Casula Lewis in Florida. She's sent down there by Carter Woodson in part, who's giving her financing. To me, that fits in a Black studies tradition, and she's trained in anthropology. She's coming out of New York, Columbia. So, although 1968 is seen as the point of origin, the momentum for that is really in the HBCUs. It's never classified as Black studies. I haven't even mentioned the humanities. Everybody from Margaret Walker Alexander down there at Jackson State who's having those early conversations. Dorothy Porter Wesley, the librarians, Hallie Quinn Brown, 19th century, they're collecting Black materials. And so finally, of course, we know by 1968 the momentum has built at places like Howard for Black studies from that generation of first generation students who are not really part of that Black bourgeoisie, don't have that mentality, who are trying to bring that pressure.
They're not first Negroes, right? They're not glad to be there. They're coming in streetwise and mad. What are you gonna do with them? They walk in the classroom, ain't nothing about Black people. They ain't buying that. They're not happy to be there. No, we're the Black people. They walk into the cafeteria, oh, this is the food? No, y'all gotta do better than this. You walk into your music class, you got no jazz, like, what's up? And so what they demanded was that their experience be reflected in the colleges that they were dragged into and given scholarships and all like that. And in order to do that, you had to go find some Black people to do it because they don't want to hear nothing from white people, right? You're the people that messed us up. You're not going to talk us out of the mess, And so there was a demand to get Black faculty. And Black studies came out of this tremendous political pressure on the part of Black students and Black people coming out of a Black power movement, Black liberation movement, with that attitude in a previously white environment.
I would suggest that two things are extremely important here. Well, three things, actually. The Association for the Study of African American Life and History, which was then the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. There's a series of other Black academic professional associations, the College of Language Arts. There's a series of journals. It's in exactly 1940 that Du Bois creates the journal Philon. Philon is the word for race in Greek, right? And so you've got these journals that have emerged in the 1940s and 50s. And when we get to the 60s, here's what jumps off, right? The seminal moment for me, in terms of a moment from the struggle that links directly to Black studies, would be the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Project. In that project, they create freedom schools. And they begin to, they discover that the young people become more interested when you give them a book by Baldwin. They become more interested when you give them Carter G. Woodson's The Negro in Our History, right? So as you give them Black material, they're more interested. And so they begin to build curricula around using material produced by Black poets, historians, sociologists, et cetera, right? And so a lot of the people who end up being leaders in Black studies had a relationship to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Many function inside the Freedom Summer Project. The people who will launch Black Power come out of that summer project as well, right? And that notion that we have to begin to teach the history in our people. Now, there's always been these things happening in the North, right? Michal's bookstore in Harlem, right? These things have always attracted, but not in the numbers that we're going to see. So there's a basis in the community through a solid Association for the Study of African American Life and History, which was then the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, Michal's bookstore and other bookstores in Black communities. But the Freedom Summer Project is seminal. Horace Mann Bond's book on education in Alabama, Coal and Steel, right? All of these take a very radical perspective using Marxist concepts that develop, and that prepares to break for the 60s. If we peel back and see what they're doing, they center the black experience, right? They're very clear on the question that would be asked in 69 by Cedric X, right? Black studies or studies of black people. They're doing black studies, meaning that black folks aren't the center, right? And it's not being told from their point of view, rooted in their culture and experience. And so that lays the foundation for what we come to know as formal black studies. So we should think about it as a discipline that develops in stages. And so those two things, 64 in the South, Freedom Summer, Freedom Schools, 65, HARU-ACT project, those things lay a base, and that I would suspect that the students who initially began to demand black studies in 1968 have some connection to, right? Nor can we dismiss the role of Lerone Bennett as the editor of Ebony Magazine in the series on what was then called Negro History, right? And he's pushing it toward black history, have on African American youth. So there's a real synergy between things that are being taught in the community through black controlled institutions, things that come out of the actual movement for liberation, like the Freedom Summer Project and Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, HARU-ACT, and what Amir Baraka and those folks are doing, and then coming together in that explosion in San Francisco. And as you say, beyond San Francisco, there are other universities that are popping off right at nearly the same moment.
And by the time Nathan Hare gets booted from Howard and ends up all the way across the country in California, that insurgency starts on HBCU campuses.
And so we have to see all of that as the soil in which black studies is being created.
A black studies department should free itself up to consider the nature of black life in developing methodologies that can be developed without interference from these other places. You're not, in other words, you're not doing what you have to do at, HWCUs, historically white schools, or PWIs or PBIs. To me, the language, normative language is important. If they're going to be PBIs, they can be PWIs. If they're going to be HBCUs, it's be HWCUs. Whiteness loves to find places to hide. So, it's HBCUs and it's PWIs. No. Let's get the same acronyms. Why? Because whiteness the power of whiteness lies in its invisibility. It likes to be normative, so it doesn't like to articulate itself. But at any rate,
before the Montgomery movement, I was not impressed. I've been riding the front of the bus all, since I was 10 years old. When it happened, I was already thinking the way they thought in '68. I was in a sea of whiteness at the University of Chicago. Liberal, but I was the only black come back each year in my department. And so consequently, I came to feel that I had a mission, and I wanted to help to make the black people more aware and concerned, because the people I knew, my wife and her school teacher friends and our friends, they thought I was crazy, my relatives too. And so I thought I would go to Howard University, which is the leading black university, and I picked them out when two professors came by from Howard to visit my boss, and he introduced them to me, and I told him I was going to work at Howard myself when I got through. And I know you had to have a job, you had to have one ready, but they said, well, let us know when you get ready. And so it happened that I did get hired at Howard, going there with the idea of making the black students more aware and concerned, and that they being the leading black university, they would have an impact on the other black colleges, they would influence, other black colleges would emulate them, other black college students would emulate them, and they would have an impact on the entire race. And that's what I went to Howard with when I got there. The students thought I was crazy, and so I sensed, because I was speaking about the things that they didn't countenance, like the theory and practice of violence. Not that I was practicing it, but I went through history and the theory and the references and all that, including Robert Williams' book, Negroes or Guns. And I presented both sides of it, and eventually it became kind of popular there. And by the end of 4 years, I was ready. And I had people in my class like Claude Brown, who wrote Man Child in the Promised Land. While he was in the college, he was working on it when I was in the class. He'd come up every day and say he was working on his book, and I had humor him along, not thinking he was going to really write a book, let alone one that was going to do what it did. Not only Stokely Carmichael, who became the Black Power main advocate, almost known advocate, because one day late in 1965, he was in town and dropped by one of my evening classes, and while we were leaving the class, walking down the hall, I noticed nobody was paying attention to him because they didn't know him at that point. And I asked him what he thought about Man Child on the Promised Land, Claude Brown writing that book, and he said, well, he laughed and said that if Claude Brown could do it, then anybody could do it. So I told him I was going to have an article in the Negro Digest in January called An Epitaph for Nonviolence. And he said, then it came out in January. When it did come out, he wrote me a note saying that SNCC was going to change from that absolutist attitude toward our strategy of nonviolence. And then in May, he said it was going to happen in May. And so I didn't think anything, but then in May he became chairman of SNCC. And I reminded everybody that the Howard students had come in third among all the universities around there, and number of books stolen. And rather than give Howard away, we should be capitalizing on his newfound interest in books on the part of Howard students. And so they didn't think it was funny at all. And I never had any rest to this day. So one thing led to another. And soon some students, freshman students, who were connected to around Revolutionary Action Movement came out talking, and finally one night we sat down and wrote this Black University Manifesto. They said while I was typing, and they put input where we called for the overthrow of the Negro College with white innards, and to raise in its place a black university relevant to the black community and its needs. Leon Dash was a student and a Post reporter, and he's the only one that attended our press conference, and he did write about what we said, and the fight was on for the rest of the year. And now I had been a little bit motivated because I come to where they're supposed to give me tenure by November the 1st, and also they have to raise my rank to associate professor, as well as give me a salary. Here it was that I was far and away the most popular professor on the campus at the time. But in any case, they did not give me my letter of rehiring.
The oldest records we have written are from ancient Egyptian text, right? But it's not self-conscious the way it is in the 60s. Nothing comes into being by itself. Everything is a result of that which came before it. So there were prior conversations and activity that led to black studies. So being involved in, of course, the civil rights movement, which actually the civil rights movement phase of the black freedom movement. A lot of times people say the civil rights movement, but actually when I say it, I mean it as a part of the black freedom movement, which has two phases to it. The civil rights phase from 55 to 65, and the black power phase from 65 to 75. And it's in the black power phase that black studies came into being.
When we talk about black studies, we have to separate two things. We have to do two things. We have to talk about those moments that what I call pre-black studies of the 1960s, and then the emergence of black studies as a field and then as a discipline after the 1960s, after Nathan Hare and the San Francisco State experience.
This is a national phenomenon. In fact, it's an international phenomenon. Not just black students at elite Ivy League universities, but black students in what is called the Pac-10, in the Big Ten, black students at the lesser school, four-year schools, black students at community colleges, because they're also fighting for black studies in Canada, right? They're also fighting for Afro-Brazilian studies in Brazil. So we have to understand it in that global sense, as well as understand it in a national sense. Now, what I think has happened in terms of Cornell and in terms of San Francisco State, Cornell is the gun. San Francisco State was a multinational struggle in the sense that Asians, Latinx, and even some of the white left participated in that struggle, right? The third world students notion. And so I think that gives San Francisco State its, and of course, Nathan Hare creates the first formal Black Studies academic program out of there. So it deserves the attention, but we have to understand that we've got to go beyond that. 64 in the South, Freedom Summer, the Freedom Schools, 65 HARU-ACT project. Those things lay a base, and that I would suspect that the students who initially began to demand Black Studies in 1968 have some connection to. Nor can we dismiss the role of Lerone Bennett as the editor of Ebony Magazine in the series on what was then called Negro History, right? And he's pushing it toward Black history, have on African American youth. So there's a real synergy between things that are being taught in the community through Black-controlled institutions, things that come out of the actual movement for liberation, like the Freedom Summer Project and Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, HARU-ACT, and what Amiri Baraka and those folks are doing, and then coming together in that explosion in San Francisco. And as you say, beyond San Francisco, there are other universities that are popping off right at nearly the same moment.
Came back out here to be the keynote speaker for the Bay Area Black Educators Conference. And so I had a great time for several days. But I went back to Washington, D.C., still unemployed and had been fired. And so I decided to go back to boxing under my own name this time. At that time, I had been on Nat Harris here and there, but I went under Nathan Hare. Well, about the end of January, I got a call from Jimmy Garrett, who was the BSU leader at the time. He had been with SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he had joined with the Black Nationalists. They had started this program in the experimental college. They called it Black Studies. And it became an issue later on about whether to call it Negro Studies, Afro-American Studies, or Black Studies, but the Black Studies went out at a time. I decided to come on out here and start the Black Studies, but I got here and the president told me they didn't want a Black Studies, but they were going to do the best they could. He didn't want me to be a troubleshooter. He told me to go down to the history department because there was a issue going on with the black students, aided by some white students breaking up the class in black history because they wanted a black professor and the administration wanted this white professor. Roland Sanders was the Torreya's name now. But Roland Sanders was the guy he didn't have any college degree, but he knew more about history than anybody ever talked to. And whereas this Jerry Combs was a PhD, young PhD white guy in history from Yale, and with 3 articles published, he boasted in learned journals, and he thought he should teach it, and so did the history department. So I went back up there and told the president, Summerskill, who would later get fired before I did. He got fired before I did. But I told him that I had not come to San Francisco State looking for the Nobel Peace Prize. Reverend King had already got the Nobel Peace Prize. And so they hired a troubleshooter, Elmer Cooper, named Elmer Cooper, who did a great job of it, but he was a troubleshooter officially, Elmer Cooper. And I told him not to bother me anymore with that.
I remember when I was a student at UCLA, we argued for courses. Ultimately, we argued for this, not initially, but ultimately for courses that were taught from a black perspective. And that was a hint that there had to be some discipline to it. But initially, we just said we want to teach these courses. And we had lots of African American professors, or let's say many African American professors, who were already ensconced in these universities, teaching in these universities and other departments, whether in School of Education or in departments of sociology, who we basically asked those people to help us form courses. But of course, those people formed those courses, and we later discovered that they were not really taught from a black perspective.
Of the academic deans, and they were there trying to decide whether to have a program also in minority studies. And I said, it's a good idea, but I don't like the word minority. And he said, well, what should we call it? And I said, because we had been discriminated against more women in the majority, like in Mississippi, in South Africa, and Maine, and Sweden. And so he said, well, what should we call it? So I said, well, for want of a better word, ethnic studies. But they were calling it minority studies. And then everything went downhill from there.
Here's the thing. In those early days when we were doing this as students, we did not anticipate all the problems that we would have. The University of California gave the center to African Americans, but it also gave us the Native American Center, the Asian American Center, and the Chicano Center. So we have 4 centers. They gave each one $150,000 a year for research grants to give to faculty, which means that the faculty members of the university also benefited from the fact that you had these centers that were already research centers that were on campus. We tried and we did create academic programs, a major, but the major at that time was like a program. And so this led us to understand that there were 3 different ways that universities were responding to this demand for black studies. One was to create departments, the other one was to create programs, and the other one was to create centers. To create a program meant that whoever directed the program had to depend on the so-called traditional departments to give faculty, to offer the courses at a certain time, and so forth. So by creating a center, we had a program, but it was always difficult to run that program. And this was like in, as I say, in 1969. Now, you may recall, some people recall history, that at a certain point there had been tension at UCLA over the creation of the African American Center. So they gave us the Center for it was called Center for Afro-American Studies, or the Afro-American Studies Center, which when I became the director of it, I changed the name to the Center for African American Studies. But, well, the tension was over the 2 things, I think. One was the direction of the program, the center. And people wanted to know whether or not the center would be engaged in the community, whether or not it would be simply a university, a department that was going to be sitting in the academy. And so the tension was basically it boiled down in people's minds, and I think it was really through the press that it boiled down into whether it was a struggle between the US organization and the Black Panthers. But actually, it was much broader than that. It was a community-wide discussion. It engaged people from all aspects of UCLA, the campus itself, as well as from the community.
In fact, women's studies also came on the heels of black studies. I wrote a major piece toward integrating women into Africana studies. And yes, I feel that women have a very real role to play in Africana studies, black studies. I tend to refer to it as Africana studies. But from the very beginning, if we go back, we have to say that Bertha Maxwell started NCBS, and I mean, it was her idea. And so we had women at the very beginning. We had Carlene Young, who became president of NCBS and very, very strong leader. We had any number of people from across the country, women who were very much involved. And of course, I was very much involved. I think probably one of the very prolific black women has been Darlene Clark Hines. And Darlene has written some very important work, and she sit on some very important boards and the like. And in fact, she was very instrumental in tapping a base for me at the Ford Foundation when I got that first $250,000 for the National Council for Black Studies. She has written some really, really significant work on black women. That's what has been her focus. She has volumes of that. But Darlene wrote one of the, if not the only book on black women nurses. And you would think that with all this health care and all these concerns about nursing, that they would bring her to the forefront to do that. But what we know with the media, larger media, it gets things that are sensational, that will bring stuff to bear. And so you will ask, well, why didn't you cite this woman? Why didn't you put this woman in your work? And I just don't think that has been the nature of women to think about putting themselves. They do the work. They do all that work in the background, as with every movement. Well, I think in the early stages of Black Studies that NCBS was the trumpeter. It was the leader. And that emanated from the fact that the first president of NBC, Dr. Bertha Maxwell Roddy, called a meeting in Charlotte because she was having difficulties there. And she felt that other folk were having difficulties with this emerging field. But I think that seminal kind of meeting, pulling people together, was the very birth of the National Council for Black Studies. And from that point on, the National Council began to develop directives. And one of the things we wanted to do was to become an accrediting body for Black Studies, that you couldn't just set up a department, but that you had to come through a national body, as you have to come through for psychology, for sociology and the like. You become accredited. And that was a part of Bertha's idea to do that, so that we had a uniform way of looking at Black people, and that we could be recognized by being accredited as Black Studies programs. The National Council for Black Studies, when we have promoted that, we began to promote that when I was president of that national body back in 1984 through 88. And I think that that was one of the major things of coming up with a unified name. Even though we have many African American studies, all kinds of names, but we have moved toward Africana, the encompassing of all black people. Now, I think another aspect of it is that we have begun to see some institutionalization of Black studies in higher education.
I'm a longtime board member, and certainly I'm a total advocate and practitioner, and so a member of the organization, and see it as the premier professional organization of Black studies. And its function has been what it should be as a professional organization. The first thing is to serve the interests of its individual and institutional members. And that means see to their needs and their aspirations, defend them, help them to do their program. The second thing is to serve as a center for a community of scholars that, through their own exchanges, advance the discipline. The other thing that is important for it is that all professional organizations, certainly in CBS does, is define the standards of the discipline, to define and establish standards for the discipline. We must say what Black studies is. White people can't tell us what Black studies is. People from other disciplines can't tell us what Africana studies is or Black studies. We must say that. Also, NCBS promotes professional and disciplinary excellence by the kind of scholarly exchange we have with our conferences, by publications, by awards and other activities of recognition of excellence among us. That's a very important thing. Publications are key to this also, because that is where we put our best idea. And our International Journal of Pan-African Studies is such a center for our publication. Although we publish in other journals, that is the Professional Organization Journal. That's NCBS's journal. The other thing is to cultivate, mentor, and support new and emerging Black studies scholars. And NCB has a mentoring organization and a young scholars organization that we deal with, which is Ankh, Wijau, and Mai. The other thing is that the NCBS is also instrumental in aiding in establishment, assessing, and sustaining other departments and programs. We are often called to support, to assess other programs in Black study. And finally, our project is to develop and publish and distribute studies and policy statements that serve as a framework for social thought and social practice. We have also, as NCBS, engaged in addressing the realities of our community, world, society, and world through publications, through scholarship, policy initiatives, advocacy, and even social action. And our challenges, of course, is to hold our ground while moving forward.
My good friend at that time, one of them was James Turner, who was at Cornell, and they had an MA program. And I had met him when I was in Buffalo. I used to be the head of the communication department at State University of New York in Buffalo. And I'd met James many times there, and we talked about programs. So when I got to Temple, I wanted to start an MA program. So I wrote an MA proposal. When I wrote the MA proposal for this university, it was kicked back to me. In other words, the committee, the graduate committee of Temple University, sent it back to me and said, you know, we just don't think that there is any value to having a master's program in African American Studies, and you got to do much more work for this. So it really made me angry. So I sent a PhD proposal, basically because, you know, I said, you know, racism is everywhere. And they don't want us to have a MA program. Let's do a PhD program. So I wrote a PhD program. I went through all the catalogs. Then you used to have the catalogs. You just sit and go through catalogs of different universities, see what they offered. And at that time, we only had four faculty members. And my issue was whether or not you could have a PhD program with just 4 faculty members. And I saw in many universities, they had departments of classics where they only have 2 people or 3 people, and they gave PhDs. Then when I created the program, it came to the graduate committee again. And they were shocked because they thought I was just going to try to do something to the MA program. I said, no, we need an MA and we need a PhD. So I gave them the PhD. And it was a lot of controversy. The head of the sociology department here at Temple said to me, she said, you will get that program over my dead body. And the history department sent a delegation down to my office, and they said, you know, our problem is that we just don't know whether or not you're going to be able to produce a quality program for this. I said, I have 17 dissertations that I've already directed at another university. What are you talking about quality? How many of you directed? I was quite upset with them. So I started off with an MA and I ended up with a PhD program. And they initially wanted to hold us to 8 students.
Without culture, we don't have Black studies. And if we move away from that culture, we don't have a Black studies. Downsides, that's one of the great challenges of Black studies today. There are 3 aspects to our studies: culture grounding, academic excellence, and social responsibility or social engagement. But it all begins with culture grounding, because without the culture, what do we teach?
I think that the field is threatened by 2 things. I meet students who have degrees in Africana studies, who don't understand the history of the field. So somehow we don't teach enough about what the origins of this field are. And sometimes we interview people for jobs here, and we are shocked that people don't know where did the field come from. I mean, how did it emerge? You got a PhD, you're declaring competence in this field, and you don't even know the origin of the field. Who are the main personalities in this field? What are the main books in this field? And many times what you discover is that the departments that they come from really are not in Black studies, even though they call themselves Black studies. They're really not in that. So the students will know, they may even know all the postmodernists. You know, they will be able to give you the names of people in post-colonial studies, but they don't know people in Africana studies. They don't know people in Africology. That's shameful. The second problem we face is a continuing problem, and that is the problem of the disbelief of our faculty associates in other departments about whether or not Africology is indeed a discipline. The only way you can fight that disbelief is to work toward creating a discipline. And a discipline will allow you to state what it is across interests. People can have many different interests, but the one driving force in Africology ought to be that we always look at issues from the standpoint of African people as being subjects of the experience. That's the driving force of the discipline. Nothing else.
What keeps Black studies together in the modern academy is what they are not what they are. These Black studies departments have surrendered the project of methodology. Historically, Black colleges and universities have failed Black studies, have failed them. You know, and for over 2 decades, I've been in one of the oldest Black studies programs in the country, one of the oldest at HBCU, at Howard. At HWCUs or PWIs, Black Studies is often, as Cornel West used to say, a crisis management unit. So the Black Studies department becomes the counseling unit, becomes the fight if something happened in the dorm unit, becomes we got to teach all the classes unit. At a HBCU, you're freed of all that. So let's just get this little place as the lab. As the great Kwame Ture used to say, Howard University represents everything in the black world and its opposite. And I think that has been the reason why Black Studies at HBCUs has not flourished. Because the assumption is that if you are in a classroom at a HBCU, you're going to get some dimension of black experiences. And so in the decades since those early Black Studies programs were formed, you see a kind of desperate attempt from institutional formations that are not out of the black community, foundations and to subsidize Black Studies in order to shape it. And what they do in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s is establish pipelines to grow scholars who are not connected to the community. So what they do then, this is where you see the rise of people like a Henry Louis Gates. So you see people who, okay, we're going to curate some folk who will give resources to, who can do archival work, who will do some very interesting interventions and thinking about things. We'll call that Black Studies, but it is cut off from the community. In my mind then, that's not Black Studies. Because Black Studies literally overwhelmed the university with an intervention that the university had to concede. We know that the long history of Black Studies, relatively speaking, in the academy over the last half century and more, the most important formations have always embraced global blackness, whether it be the attempts at Cornell to create this kind of African-US, African-Caribbean configuration, whether it be, Pan-Africanism, always an important thrust. What I think is fascinating to me in terms of the possibilities of Black Studies is the likelihood that the most important interventions are not going to come from any of the settler colonies. Meaning what? Not the United States of America, not Latin America, because I think settler colonialism colors the way we think about African life in the so-called Western Hemisphere in ways that we are yet to free ourselves from. I think the most important interventions could very likely come from the continent of Africa. I think some of the things that have been piloted at places like the University of Witwatersrand, the whole question of the African Renaissance and some of that work, I'm just very excited because at least there's a language point of entry that, while undernourished, can certainly be brought up to speed much quicker. Nathan Hare, if for no other reason than he is a man who the times shaped. This is a man who helped lead the insurgency at Howard, for which he lost his job. And he was the man, when they called forth and said, we're going to do this at the department level, he's the man they, of course, called in the San Francisco State. So Hare is indispensable in that genealogy.
Historians tried to rescue our history that had been overlooked and talk about our contribution to the country. But what Black Studies needs now is an analysis of America. As I said, because we were all on this ship called America. They don't teach the American audience that Martin talked about America as the citadel of hate. I forgot his April 4th, because he was killed a year after he gave his anti-Vietnam War speech. But he called America the citadel of terrorism, or something in that speech. But you never hear about that. You don't see the pictures of the occasions when Martin and Malcolm met in the halls of Congress. And Martin evolves. I quote Martin in my Malcolm X book. 6 months before he's assassinated, Martin says that everything he has been doing has not worked. The whole thing has to be done away with. So Black Studies needs, like IBW, we need to be analyzing America. And we need to be clarifying what is our relation to America. Because one of the interesting possibilities is that the people who have been historically persecuted by America are possibly the only people who can save it.
Future of Black Studies is black. It looks good to me. It's beautiful in the same way we used to talk about it. But it's challenging. And it is a future of struggle and growth and struggle and growth, right? It is struggle that is defensive. It is a struggle that is development. And it is a struggle that lays the basis for our flourishing. And I look forward to it. I believe struggle is one of the most characteristic aspects, not only of our own history, but of humanity itself. We struggle to come into being. That's called birth. We struggle to make the most out of being. That's called life. And we struggle not to go out of being. That's called the quest for immortality. So we're struggling all the time and everywhere, and I welcome it.